Bonjour, je m'appelle Robert Toombs et je suis président de l'Académie royale des arts du Canada, fondée en 1880 par la même loi qui a créé le Musée des beaux-arts du Canada. L'Académie est aujourd'hui un collège électoral composé de plus de 650 artistes, designers et artisans. I'm very pleased that one of our board members, media artist Udo Schiemann, has curated today's conversation. Luc has had a distinguished career. He took part in the emergence of media arts 50 years ago when, as a video artist inspired by a generation of experimental filmmakers such as Michael Snow and Hollis Frampton, he adopted computer technologies. He's now engaged in the creation of social virtual worlds with a particular interest in the transitions between the physical and the virtual experiences of space and of human interactions. Luc is a graduate of NASCAD and holds a Master of Science degree in Visual Studies from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 2020, Luc received a Governor General's Visual and Media Arts Award. Luc, over to you.
Merci Robert de ta confiance et bienvenue toutes et tous à cet échange inspiré par un texte de Zainub Verjee, bonjour Zainub, bienvenue, sur la culture et la souveraineté. Today is Earth Day. As inhabitants of the biosphere, which we transform as much as we are transformed by it, I acknowledge the contributions of all living and non-living entities that have cycled here before us. They are active agents of dynamic polarities between nature and culture. Amongst these, let's celebrate in particular the First Nations' historic and current inspiring contributions, wherever we are. I now speak from the Sutton Missisquoi Hills on traditional Abenakis land. It also seems fair to recognize the materials, the forces, and the ingenuity used to form the technologies enabling today's meeting. Les langues que nous parlons sont la première expression de nos souverainetés individuelles et collectives. Elles sont toutes accueillies ici. The languages we speak are the first expression of our individual and collective sovereignties. They are all welcomed here. We count on the interpreters amongst us to translate when needed. I will be one of them between French and English. I also encourage all of you to use the chat thread to interpret, comment, question, and eventually translate in any language you master. À l'occasion, je serai votre interprète entre le français et l'anglais. The opening 20-minute presentation will be followed by reactions from a panel of rapporteurs and by comments or questions from the audience in the chat. I now invite you all to turn your microphone off. I think it already was turned off automatically. Assurez-vous, s'il vous plaît, que vos micros sont fermés. Okay, now the presentation. Canada is at the crossroads in a world of political unrest, climate crisis, and shifting global powers. Sovereignty can no longer be defined by armies or trade deals alone. What truly holds a nation together, what makes it sovereign, is culture. The Royal Canadian Academy of Art is pleased to welcome Dr. Zainub Verjee, a visionary artist, policymaker, and public intellectual, to this special event as Canada is choosing a new leadership. She will bring vision, urgency, and a clear voice to the question of how we, as a people, can move forward with culture as our cornerstone. Her opening statement will set the stage for a conversation amongst participants, which we hope will expose converging views and a path forward. La conférence d'ouverture de Zainub ouvrira une conversation entre les participants qui, nous l'espérons, exposera des points de vue convergents et une voie à suivre. Please welcome Dr. Zainub Verjee.
Peut-être que tu veux dire pour le chat que ce sera.
Thank you. Bonjour à toutes et tous. Et c'est vraiment un plaisir d'être parmi des amis, des collègues, des pairs et des confrères artistes. Et merci Charlouk d'avoir organisé cette rencontre. Et merci à Robert Toombs et l'Académie royale des arts du Canada de m'accueillir pour cette conversation. Welcome and thank you for joining, everyone. Now, as this election campaign has shown, the statistical evidence is that young people can decide this election, the outcome of the election and the future of this country, as millennials and Gen Z will now make up the electoral majority. And this is per Amanda Monday, who works towards raising youth voter turnout in Canada. So we know that this is an important factor to keep in mind also in today's conversation. But today my endeavor is not to be prescriptive or to provide solutions, but rather open up the issue at hand and create space to think, to challenge, and to imagine differently. So to me, in a way, this all feels like déjà vu. I was there in the 1980s on the front lines of the cultural tariff debates, standing with others to defend Canadian culture from being swallowed up by free trade. That was the Thatcher-Reagan-Mulroney era, when neoliberalism was sweeping across borders, turning public goods into market commodities. And in that tide, culture was not spared. It was treated as just another exportable product, something to be priced, traded, or cut. And it was the time when culture was taken out of the communication and technology department, and Brian Mulroney, who had brought in the maverick Marcel Mauss, and the Mauss saga was revealing, and Mulroney actually had to remove him and put him aside. He was afraid that Marcel Mauss would interfere with the free trade agreements. But we knew better. We knew that we weren't simply fighting for funding. We were fighting for the principle that culture matters, that it is not a line item in a trade agreement, but a living, breathing expression of who we are and how we imagine the future. That fight didn't end quickly. It took over a decade of persistent effort to achieve what became a global milestone, UNESCO's Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, adopted in 2005. It was a hard-won recognition of what many of us already knew. Culture is a human right and not a commodity. Now, I've seen this struggle play out on multiple fronts. In the wake of the failed Meech Lake Accord, I served as Vancouver's moderator for the Spicer Commission, the Citizens Forum on Canada's Future. And that was another moment of rupture, uncertainty, and also deep reflection. And one laid bare the tensions and aspirations shaping this country. Today, we find ourselves in another defining moment. This gathering, today focused on culture as the cornerstone of cultural sovereignty, speaks to a question many of us in this room have lived with for decades. For some, it's been an intellectual pursuit. For others, a long life profession. But for all of us, it is a question that refuses to go away. What is Canadian culture, and who gets to shape it? We currently have Stephen Guilbeault serving as Minister of Canadian Identity and Biodiversity in the Department of Canadian Heritage. Now, this very title of his role is telling. It reflects an important shift, one that acknowledges the profound interconnection between nature and culture, and the fact that Canadian identity is rooted in both. Today, when I speak of culture, I'm using the term in a holistic sense, one that includes not just the arts and heritage, but also our values, our languages, and also our evolving relationships to land, memory, and community. But today, the urgency feels different. This isn't just about defining culture. It's about defending the space to imagine it freely. It's about the imperative of cultural sovereignty, the ability to tell our own stories in our own voices, on our own terms, at a time when that very capacity is under pressure from all sides: market forces, political stagnation, and digital monopolies. So the question before us is not abstract, it is immediate. What does it mean to protect and expand our cultural sovereignty at this moment? So today I want to speak to three key ideas as part of that effort, and in offering a big picture. The first is approaches to culture. From what culture is to what culture does. Canadian culture is something with which many of us have grappled with for over many decades, and for some of us here, it has defined one professional pathway that has embedded questioning, elucidating, shaping, and nurturing Canadian culture. Now, I've been playing with a set of ideas and developing arguments from the politics of public imagination to labor to reimagining the Massey Report, etc. And I'm sure that some of you have heard me before. All are interlinked, critical, and urgent questions. In its rhetorical impetus, defining Canadian culture in a way could be termed as a national hobby, wherein its icons, symbols, and curious practices capture the popular imagination. How proudly we spot Canadians, perhaps the only people in the world who still wear their own flag on their backpacks and luggage, and they wear it as conspicuously as possible. A curious practice that started in the anti-Vietnam War period in the late 60s and 70s, distinguishing and asserting our non-Americanness for the obvious reasons because of the values that we preemptively understand to be Canadian. We quickly learned in the case of the RCMP, the red serge uniform, the iconic RCMP image, was controlled by Disney, who purchased its trademark. We gain clarity on what is culture as we move away from culture as a noun to culture as a verb. When we speak of culture as a noun, we're often referring to a way of life, the shared customs, practices, and values of a people. But if we think of culture as a verb, it shifts the conversation. It is no longer just about what culture is, it becomes about what culture does. It's not about being a grammarian here, but it's rather in situating culture thus. We are able to encapsulate multiple philosophical and ideological approaches. You know, from Matthew Arnold, who was a Victorian-era literary figure, to Raymond Williams, who was a Welsh cultural critic and theorist, and onwards. And for instance, in the essay, Culture is Ordinary, Raymond Williams' efforts are to excavate culture from the grip of the elites who controlled the word's meaning for over 200 years, and thus to reclaim the word culture and its meaning. Raymond Williams opened up the relationship between culture and society. Much like in the domains of arts, letters, and faith, culture is, at its core, a process of collective meaning-making, one that is shared, yet inevitably contested. You know, for instance, the opposition between women's rights and cultural rights, and it refers to a common but problematic framing when women's rights are seen in conflict with cultural rights. As cultures are not homogeneous or static, they evolve, mix, and often resist neat definitions. This is especially true in Canada, where our cultural fabric is deeply paradoxical, shaped by settler colonialism, multicultural mythologies, and pluralist aspirations. Art in its broadest purview is a language, and language remains an important everyday material for me to reflect and engage with as an artist. It is about the relationship between language and power, and I've also argued elsewhere that the crisis in our politics is actually a crisis in language. Do you know that every 2 weeks a language dies? And when it does, a way of thinking dies with it. So culture is not just about content, it is about capacity, it is about the ability to think, associate, and imagine. And as G.N. Devi puts it, quote, "To keep our democracies alive, we need to keep our languages alive. Language as art and power is the ground zero for cultural sovereignty. And that sovereignty is under threat, not only from external influence, but from internal incoherence." So the second point I want to talk about is the encroachment on culture. So when we ask what is culture, we're not just asking about art, language, or tradition. We're also asking about power and ideology. And to unpack this, I want to point to what's often known or called the cultural turn of the mid-20th century. It is a moment when culture becomes a central arena for political struggle and intellectual inquiry. And during this period, two disciplines rose in parallel and often in tension: economics and cultural studies. And two figures in particular stand out as emblematic of this divide: Friedrich Hayek, the neoliberal economist and Nobel laureate, and Raymond Williams, the Welsh literary critic and social thinker. Both were shaped by the Cold War, and both understood that culture wasn't reflective, it was formative, but they saw its function in radically different terms. Hayek believed that culture evolved best through markets and spontaneous order, and that freedom was about limiting government and letting individual choices shape society. Williams, on the other hand, argued that culture is deeply entangled with class, ideology, and power, that it is not neutral, and that structures shaping cultural life must be exposed and contested. In Hayek, we see culture as an outcome of economic liberty. In Williams, we see culture as a battleground for meaning and justice. These aren't just historical theories. They continue to shape our institutions, our policies, and how we frame cultural value today, whether we realize it or not. Understanding these tensions is essential if we are to take culture seriously and not just as expression, but as political field. The manufacturing of a national culture as a project, as we saw in our own Massey report, is embedded in these contested discourses and deeply influenced. Following the Washington Consensus, the institutionalization of the neoliberal turn marks the trumping of Hayek's premise. When we look at the formative period of post-war Canada, it's helpful to think of it in two broad phases: the 50s to the 70s, and then the 80s through to the 90s. And together, these decades mark the transformation of Canadian society, socially, demographically, and politically. We saw a shift from a relatively homogeneous settler narrative to an increasingly plural, urban, multicultural reality. The rise of new social movements, constitutional debates, immigration waves, Indigenous resistance, and all of these have contributed to the shaping of what Canada is. And yet, here's the irony. Despite this profound societal morphing, the cultural armature, the foundational framework for Canadian culture laid out by Massey in the Massey Report in 1951 has largely remained intact. The institutions, assumptions, and ideological scaffolding of that report have continued to define how we fund, understand, and legislate culture in this country. While the society has evolved, the cultural infrastructure has stayed curiously still. And that gap between a changing Canada and a static cultural framework is something we have yet to fully confront. Now, the 1970s defined the nexus of the national and the neoliberal as the economic discourse of industry, rather than the establishment of national culture, and has dominated cultural policy discussions in Canada. After almost 3 decades of existence, the Massey narrative on culture was altered by the Applebaum-Hebert report on the arts by inserting the idea of Canadian culture into the continental economy and thus separating the very notion of Canadian culture into two, public and private good. In subsequent decades, one sees the rhetoric of the national culture as an export staple and a vehicle for a Canadian economic growth. And this is littered on websites of government agencies, right from Canadian Heritage to Canada Council of the Arts to Global Affairs, etc. And the focus of cultural policy making has drifted towards the functional view. It was Francis Fox, as Minister of Communication, who argued in the late 70s for culture as the means of economic independence. And remember Telefilm Canada? The reference to Francis Fox as Minister of Communication points to a key moment in the development of Canada's cultural policy infrastructure, especially around the establishment of Telefilm Canada and the framing of culture as a tool for economic sovereignty. Now, even in this election, you see it's being framed in economic sovereignty. And in the debates we've heard recently, Carney said he would increase funding to Telefilm. Now, recollect also the Chrétien administration statement in 1905, coinciding with the Washington Consensus, Canada in the world, le Canada dans le monde. Okay, so the third thing and the last point I want to make is culture as a constitutional ambiguity. And let me turn to this constitutional puzzle that is culture in Canada and how the federal government has navigated this ambiguity, especially in the period between the Meech Lake and the Charlottetown Accords and into the present. Now, as many of you know, culture is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution Act of 1867. It doesn't exist as a discrete category of jurisdiction. Provinces understandably claim culture through their authority over property and civil rights and matters of local nature. And yet for decades, the federal government has exercised enormous influence over culture, not through legislation, but through something else, spending power. This ambiguity, this constitutional silence has actually worked in Ottawa's favor. Rather than wading into jurisdictional conflict, the federal government has simply funded culture into existence, supporting national institutions like the CBC, the Canada Council, the National Film Board, Telefilm, and dozens of others. These institutions are not just cultural players. They're not just cultural players. They are nation builders. They shape narratives, define Canadian content, and fund the very imagination of this country. Now, if we situate this within the context of Meech Lake 1987 and the Charlottetown Accords of 1992, we start to see how central and how contested culture really is. Meech Lake, as you'll recall, was focused on bringing Quebec into the constitutional fold. It didn't directly address culture, but the subtext was unmistakable. Quebec wanted greater control over cultural matters, especially language and identity, and it was a quiet push for cultural sovereignty. Charlottetown, 5 years later, made things more explicit. It acknowledged the need to protect national cultural institutions, but also recognized the province's role in fostering cultural roots. It even floated the idea of negotiated agreements, cultural accords, between the federal government and provinces. And some provinces, notably Quebec, saw this as an opportunity to assert formal control. But in the end, the accord avoided constitutionalizing any of it. And why? Because to define culture constitutionally would be to unravel the division of powers itself. Culture is too broad, too indeterminate. As one committee said during the Charlottetown process, quote, culture is not a category with any constitutional significance. Either level of government is free to enact laws that affect culture as long as there's a constitutional foundation. So what does Ottawa do? Ottawa funds culture as national interest, not jurisdiction. It uses spending power to exercise cultural influence without provoking constitutional battles. No formal jurisdiction required, just money and mandate, all enabled by a constitution that neither authorizes nor prohibits such actions. This is why, to this day, Ottawa plays a dominant role in shaping national culture, even though provinces continue to argue that it is their domain. And this is precisely what makes cultural sovereignty in Canada so complex. It is not defined by law, but by practice, not claimed through power, but through policy. The Constitution may be silent, but the federal government speaks clearly through its funding choices. And so, as we consider the idea of a new Massey report, a new cultural roadmap, we must also confront this deeper question. What kind of cultural federalism do we want? What kind of cultural federalism do we want? Do we continue to navigate this strategic ambiguity? Or is it time to reimagine the constitutional architecture of culture altogether? So to wrap up, I want to say that Canada remains a modernist project, and so does its culture. But in a world grappling with authoritarianism, digital monopolies, and cultural erasure, we have a chance, perhaps a responsibility, to stand as a cultural counterweight. And as critic Narendra Patkare wrote, quote, "At the heart of Canada's political stagnation is not scandal or polarization, it's managerialism. Governance reduced to risk management. This isn't unique to Canada, but here it runs deep, almost cultural. And our national instinct for stability and order has calcified into chronic fear of disruption." So in this so-called era of the most consequential elections of our time, a phrase we now hear at every cycle, the irony is hard to ignore. What's at stake isn't a bold new direction, but the continued flattening of political ambition. Leaders speak the language of empathy, equity, affordability, inclusion, but these words often function more as branding than belief. And the grammar is progressive, but the substance is hollow. What we need now is not just policy reform. We need a cultural reawakening, a reawakening that reminds us that culture is not an accessory to national life, but its foundation. At a time when our public imagination is under siege by market logics, platform algorithms, and political inertia, the call for cultural sovereignty is not nostalgic. It is strategic. It is urgent. Cultural sovereignty means having the power to tell our own stories in our own languages and on our own terms. It means refusing to outsource our identity, our memory, or our future. And without it, we're not just losing art, we're losing the very capacity to imagine who we are and what we might become. And that is a crisis that no legislation alone can fix. A new Massey report would be our cultural manifesto. It would assert that Canadian identity is not a relic, but a living force, and that Canadian pluralism is not just a demographic, but a philosophical commitment, that our stories matter, Indigenous, immigrant, rural, urban, Francophone, Anglophone, not just because they're different, but because they belong in the world. Let us not make a mistake. This is a battle for the Canadian imagination, and the stakes are nothing less than who we are and who we might still become. And thank you.
How do you applaud on a Zoom? Can you hear the crowd cheering, Zainub? Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup, Zainub. Il y a beaucoup de choses à décompresser ici. There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. So I think you agreed to make your presentation available both in French and in English on request, I think. Hein? That's what we agreed. Alors, pour ceux qui voudraient avoir la version de la présentation de Zainub en français, vous n'avez qu'à faire la demande dans le chat et puis on vous la fera parvenir. Alors, OK. L'idée, c'est d'allumer un feu. The match was yours, Zainub. There's a lot of material to burn there, but we have the privilege to have what we call the rapporteur, a host of five people who have agreed to jump in with the reactions, questions, comments. And so I will invite them. We already agreed on a list, and I believe we start with Udo Schiemann. Let me shortly present you Udo. Udo Schiemann is Principal Creative Director at Entro Communication, where he leads a team of professionals in identity development, corporate communication, and branded environment. A native of Germany, Udo came to Canada to work with Gottschalk and Ash International in 1999. Udo's work has focused on integrated wayfinding systems and branded environments for institutions and companies in various sectors. His work has received numerous awards, like the Red Dot and SEGD Award, and has been published in multiple national and international magazines. So, Udo, it's your mic.
Thank you, Luc. Thank you, Zainub, for this excellent report. It's really exciting. I came in '99 from Germany to Canada, and I was puzzled but also fascinated by how this society can live together with so many different people from all over the world. And I always felt and still think it's a precious good that we have that is so enriching for our lives at work, in private, in culture, in every moment. And it is precious and it can be lost. And I have seen that growing up in post-war Germany, that a society that lost its identity basically overnight, and through the Americanization, through movies, through literature, through art, through radio, everything we saw and listened to was from America. And it is very critical because I see how the youth, especially, who is less critical, could be, influenced so dramatically and loses its own culture in favor of something else. I see this threat, let's say, here as well. Maybe less dramatic, but indeed the youth is the future, and the youth can be persuaded very easily, and it needs government support to put a counter imagination, as you call it, to the youth and to our life, and make this the precious goods that we really have. And that's very important, I think.
Thank you, Udo. You were perfectly clear and brief and concise. Thank you so much. And I have to say, you're a member of the RCA for how many years now?
About 4 or 5 years.
4 or 5 years. So, thank you so much. I think now we can move to Jenn Law. Are you ready, Jenn, to open your microphone? I will briefly introduce you. Jenn Law is a Toronto-based artist and social anthropologist working across print-based media. Her multidisciplinary practice explores cultural ecologies and strategies of material storytelling. She has exhibited her work internationally, has published widely on contemporary art and print culture, and is the co-founder of the experimental publishing platform Arts Plus Letters Press with Penelope Stewart, who had the grace of introducing me to you. So welcome, Jenn.
Thank you. And thank you, Zainub, for your timely and very thought-provoking presentation. And thanks to the RCA for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm very honored to be included in the conversation. I think that for me, in this time of great uncertainty, I feel a sense of hope. And Zainub, in your cultural call to action, and it's given me so much to reflect upon in the days leading up to this discussion. I think to begin with, it's fair to say that the strategic tack we take on these issues could vary considerably from today to this time next week, depending on the outcome of the upcoming election. And it feels like there's so much at stake, not only for Canada as a nation, but for the role that Canada could play on the international stage. We continue to face very real threats, I think, to our culture and to our territorial sovereignty, and by extension to our democracy, not only from outside of our borders, but from within. My personal strategy for thinking through these questions of sovereignty has been through the lens of democracy itself and trying to understand attempts to undermine it, particularly by far-right movements that target cultural freedoms and human rights, threatening to dismantle cultural institutions, including and importantly education, rolling back environmental protections, while exacerbating and exploiting socio-political divides. In a discussion of democracy under threat from increasing polarity, my primary question is what role culture can play in helping us to reach each other and connect, especially in a country that's so often divided by competing provincial interests. I fully agree with you, Zainub, that culture is a verb and that it matters as a human right. I'd like to consider how we may ratify culture into policy in a way that's fully inclusive of diversity while allowing it to evolve in real time. For now, I'll take on board your important point that managerialism is a threat to cultural sovereignty, as well as the risk of federal governance reduced to risk management, avoiding disruption. And in the urgency of now, I worry that our political divides continue to hinder our ability to adequately protect culture through policy reform, to protect our own stories and our ability to tell them. For we're facing the possibility of a conservative government, potentially, which will assume power that aims to govern by disruption and dismantlement as its main strategy. And I think that there's something to be said for the ideological polarity, or something to keep in mind about the ideological polarity that is not dissimilar to how you write about the Cold War and the publication of the first Massey Report in 1951, when we're facing a freedom versus totalitarianism, capitalism versus communism, pitched as a battle for civilization. But I do remain cautiously hopeful that with this election, we may be offered the possibility of a middle ground. And I think we need to perhaps reach towards this middle ground as the most stable place to stand. The middle can withstand internal and external pressures, but it's not a fixed point, but rather a moving target. It doesn't require that we agree on all things in order to meet, but it requires us to reach across to each other, to listen, and to identify opportunities for compromise within reason. It asks us to give in order to gain and in order to live together. I think I'll end on this note of finding ways of compromise in order to protect culture and in order to continue to tell our stories past whatever happens in the election next week. And I hope that this conversation is just the beginning of an ongoing conversation. And I thank you for including me in it.
Merci, thanks, Jenn. As you said, we hope it's the beginning. Et je réalise que on n'a pas les moyens ni le temps de tout traduire Mais ce qu'on va faire, Bob, cher président, nous allons traduire tout le texte de cet enregistrement et le rendre disponible. Donc, on s'excuse à ceux qui peut-être suivent moins bien les présentations en anglais, mais on s'assurera que vous pourrez accéder à la traduction française. So, David, you're next. I was hoping you would make your presentation in French. We've known each other for 40 years, but unfortunately, I didn't convince you to, to speak in French in public yet, but there's hope. So, David, what can I say about you? You're in Italy right now, and thanks for connecting with us. David Peters is a consulting designer who creates ideas that shape how people understand and act in the world. He advocates the use of design to advance positive social change and has been the lead consulting designer to the Wikipedia Foundation, Creative Commons, Wiki Education, Spur, the Ocean Conservancy, and other progressive organizations. David's work and writings have been widely featured in the design press, and he has taught in the graphic design program at Yale University, RISD, and his alma mater, NASCAD University, formerly Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. Please welcome David Peters.
Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Zainub. I'm here in Italy in a cavern, so if there's a bit of echo, that's why. I want to circle back, Zainub, right to your opening remarks about Gen Z and the concerns that I have for what I call attention control and the problems that it's posing social, like the society in which we exist now. If we treat culture as language, culture as communication, culture as the capacity to communicate, as possessing narratives, I think these are really under threat from what formerly was entertainment as a commodity to now where we're being occupied with a sort of domination of attention. You know, there's a certain fellow on the other side of that border who demands my attention practically every day, if not every hour. And it's really oppressive. And for us, the concern I have here is the ongoing impoverishment of the cultural systems that we're part of. And what I hear as an ambition and the framing of an ambition to reassert and foreground our Canadian imagination in a new kind of ecology of enrichment. And what forms could that ecology of enrichment take? You know, versus the systematic degradation of us as human beings, let alone as Canadians. And I don't want that to be a tactical question. I mean, it's a deeper question of what is the nature of infrastructure in this at this time, and you know, might it be like to be an infrastructure that is both digital and self-generative. I mean, for culture to persist, for culture to thrive, we have to find these new techniques of it self-generating, and so those are my immediate thoughts. I don't want to take too long. I know many people have questions.
Merci, David. Very a lot to unpack here as well. Again, we'll make sure that this is well translated to be available. The next presenter will be Mary Ann Barkhouse. Hello, Mary Ann. You're very well dressed, perhaps for
Thank you.
Circumstances.
That's right. It's cold here again.
Okay, so Mary Ann Barkhouse, wonderful artist, born in Vancouver, BC, with strong ties to both coasts, as her mother is from Namajik's band. Sorry for the pronunciation, but Wakwas First Nation of Allard Bay. Sorry for that. BC, and her father is of a German and British descent from Nova Scotia, a descendant of a long line of internationally recognized Northwest Coast artists. She graduated with honors from the Ontario College of Art in Toronto and has exhibited widely across Canada and the United States. Barkhouse works examines ecological concerns and intersection of culture through the use of animal imagery, inspired by issues surrounding empire and survival. Barkhouse creates installations that evoke consideration of the self as a response to history and environment. And you're a member of the RCA.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thank you for even trying to pronounce my First Nation. That was admirable, and it's I'm from the Namgis First Nation, Kwakwawiwa. Also, we're part of the Kwakwawiwa. Kwakwawiwa means the Kwakwala-speaking people, and we're occupy the part that's sort of around the northern end of Vancouver Island. So this. I suppose the topic of this of Zainab's presentation hits very close to home for me in terms of what the preoccupation of my artwork has been, which just goes about empire and survival. I think those two things that just hits the nail on the head. I think this ideas of encroachment on culture has something that has been dealt with by all Indigenous communities across this continent for hundreds of years, and how the different communities have navigated through that with some success, some less success. It's all across the board, but I'd like to think that the integrity of a lot of our First Nations community in Canada they're not unscathed, but they have survived in a really with great vitality, and that perhaps that is something that should be brought into this conversation. I don't have a answer across the board, but just saying that this is an in to how has that happened? How has, despite all this persecution, how has that survival been? How have they not only survived, but how has that culture done it so vibrantly in some cases? Also, coming from a rural standpoint, as well as the Indigenous, I wanted to bring into the conversation the aspects of the physical and material connections that need to be considered once again as we're looking for new ways forward, because it's just hand in hand with the conceptual and with the digital and the innovation that needs to go in there, that we need to encompass to bring this forward. We also need to acknowledge that we need those connections across the country. So that goes to speak to I think in a great part to making the arts and the different diversity of voices heard and accessible, and not just an elitist endeavor that comes out of the urban centers. It's there are a lot of obstacles, but there's also solutions that we can come up with. So if we're rethinking this as a whole, I see how that over the years that those connections have really been eroded, and we have to look for new ways to reestablish those, and what does that look like? So again, thank you very much for including me in the conversation.
The points you make are so important, Mary Ann. J'ai envie de traduire. Moi, ce que je comprends, what I understand is that sovereignty, language is the key of sovereignty. But language is, of course, French, English, or whatever First Nation language. But it's also art. Zainub, you make that point that art is a language. And if we cannot survive just by our langue maternelle, which would be unfortunate, and this is why Quebec, fights so much for, because if we can preserve that, we can preserve a lot of the culture. But you can at least survive with your art. And this is why it's so important to foster our process and to protect the imagination, not to outsource our imagination, as you said so well, Zainub. So thank you for this, and we'll translate that properly and make it available to everybody. Charlotte, bonjour. Comment ça va?
Ça va bien, merci.
Bon. Have you been able to follow so far?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I think your English is very good, but you might prefer to speak in French. If you choose that, I will try to summarize what you have said, but again, we'll translate later. So Charlotte Panaccio-Letendre is the directrice générale et artistique du Centre d'artistes vertical. Elle s'est jointe à l'équipe du Centre en 2011 pour porter le projet d'infrastructure de l'organisme. Son parcours académique en art visuel, médiatique, en histoire de l'art et en gestion des organismes culturels lui a permis de s'impliquer activement dans plusieurs conseils d'administration du milieu culturel. Plus récemment, elle s'est jointe à la grande mobilisation pour les arts au Québec, la GMAQ, qui milite pour une meilleure reconnaissance des arts et une hausse des budgets dédiés à la culture au niveau provincial et fédéral. Si tu permets, Charlotte, je vais traduire en anglais. Charlotte Panaccio-Letendre is the General and Artistic Director of Vertical, an artist center in Laval, Quebec. She joined the team in 2011 to lead the organization's large infrastructure project. Her academic background in visual art, media art, art history, and management of cultural organization has allowed her to be actively involved in several boards of directors in the cultural sector. More recently, she joined the Great Mobilization for the Arts in Quebec, the GMAQ, which campaigns for better recognition of the arts and an increase in budgets dedicated to culture at the provincial and federal level. Bienvenue, Charlotte.
Merci. Merci, Luc, pour la traduction simultanée. Merci beaucoup, Zainub, pour le texte et la présentation. C'est enrichissant comme réflexion à mener ensemble. Puis merci aux autres rapporteurs qui sont là aujourd'hui. Ça permet d'avoir une discussion qui est peut-être pas toujours possible d'avoir dans les structures actuelles qu'on a. Qui est une discussion qui serait plus une discussion de fond. Donc, c'est ça, comme tu le nommais aussi, Zainub, donc pas quelque chose de prescriptif, mais qui vient nourrir notre imaginaire sur ce qui est possible de faire pour la culture et pour les arts. Donc, c'est sûr qu'à la grande mobilisation pour les arts du Québec, on s'est concentré, je vais juste faire la petite, ici, voilà. Je m'excuse, j'avais une petite fenêtre Zoom à confirmer. Donc, on s'est concentré. En fait, ça a pris forme au printemps 2024, donc juste en amont du budget provincial. Donc, il y a eu des manifestations qui se sont organisées. Donc, je vais y aller avec quelque chose de très concret, premièrement, pour essayer de faire des ponts avec la présentation de Zainub aussi. Donc, il y a eu des manifestations juste avant le budget provincial. Il y a eu des fonds qui ont été octroyés puis qui sont allés strictement aux organisations qui sont des clientèles du Conseil des arts et des lettres du Québec. Donc, à ce moment-là, les organismes étaient vraiment en processus pour majorer leur budget. Puis c'est là que les fonds sont allés. Il y a eu un épuisement, dans le fond, des personnes engagées à la GMAC pendant l'été. Ça a été repris par des nouvelles personnes, donc dont certaines sont ici, Julie Bruneau, Edith Brunette, il y a aussi Sarah A. Tremblay, Clément de Gaulle-Jacques. Donc, on est vraiment plusieurs à avoir porté ce dossier-là. De revendiquer, dans le fond, des meilleures conditions de travail et de vie pour les artistes, donc pour les artistes et les travailleurs culturels. Peut-être une des spécificités de la GMAQ aussi, c'était de ne pas vouloir se substituer aux syndicats en art, ni aux regroupements nationaux qui sont présents dans notre milieu, donc en danse, en théâtre, en littérature. Puis je pense un des aspects qui a été fort de la GMAQ, c'est justement de fédérer l'ensemble des disciplines artistiques. Donc je pense que on est habitué au Québec de travailler par secteur disciplinaire, donc d'avoir des réflexions qui sont faites autour de particularités qui sont liées à des affinités artistiques ou des spécificités de secteur, alors que la GMAQ est venue vraiment élargir et solidariser l'ensemble des acteurs du milieu artistique, je dirais plus que culturel, là. Donc, il y a une reprise à l'automne dernier, dans le fond, il y a quand même eu une accroissance à la fois de la présence médiatique de la crise des arts au Québec. Donc, ça a été vraiment un élément important, c'est-à-dire il y a eu la fondation du Front commun aussi, qui venait regrouper 21 organisations culturelles, donc justement les regroupements nationaux, les syndicats. Il y a eu une présence accrue aussi de la GMAQ dans la sphère publique. Puis, toutes sortes il y a eu comment dire, des alliés inattendus aussi, comme la Chambre de commerce du Grand Montréal aussi, qui a fait le lancement d'une étude sur l'importance de la culture pour le dynamisme économique, donc souvent très lié au tourisme. Mais c'était quand même intéressant de voir qu'il y avait plusieurs perspectives, soit celle aussi de la culture de proximité, donc dans les quartiers. Donc, je pense qu'il y avait cet élément de tension-là que Zainub a bien présenté aussi entre l'art comme quelque chose de vivant, comme un droit, mais aussi comme un objet plutôt économique au sortir de la COVID pour revitaliser le centre-ville notamment. Il y a eu un moment, je ne veux pas prendre trop de temps, mais c'est une séquence un peu historique, donc c'est important pour moi de la faire. Il y a eu un moment aussi où la GMAC a cristallisé ses revendications envers le gouvernement du Québec. Donc, la première était très tangible, c'était la majoration du budget du Conseil des arts et des lettres du Québec à 200 millions pour son budget de base. Donc, on est vraiment justement dans un middle ground qui bouge, donc dans une revendication qui est très ciblée. Puis on avait une autre revendication qui est celle d'un programme de soutien aux artistes. Donc, celle-là plus liée au filet social, dans le fond, pour les artistes puis pour les travailleurs du milieu culturel. Donc, peut-être qu'on a vu, c'est à quel point on a pu, c'est ça, maintenir une tension. On a publié aussi une lettre ouverte dans le Devoir qui a récolté environ 1700 signatures, donc, et qui s'intitulait Tous les arts sont vivants. Donc, pour nommer l'importance d'avoir des arts qui non pas strictement qui sont des représentations, mais bien comprendre comment les arts font partie de la vie quotidienne et qu'elles sont essentielles à la constitution d'une communauté ou d'une société. Puis c'est cette lettre-là qui a été, je dirais, le catalyseur pour des discussions, pour une rencontre avec le ministre de la Culture, Mathieu Lacombe. Pendant ce temps-là, c'est ça, je pense que comment dire, ce qui a porté fruit, dans le fond, c'est à la fois ce que j'ai nommé comme étant la triangulation, la tension avec les journalistes et le gouvernement, donc la tension maintenue dans l'espace public sur ces enjeux-là. Il y a eu donc des artistes à des heures de grande écoute, mais d'autre part, je pense que tout ce qui a été dialogue avec l'équipe du ministre, dialogue avec l'équipe du Conseil des arts et des lettres aussi, puis avec les regroupements nationaux, a vraiment fait partie, je dirais, de la réussite parce qu'effectivement, le ministre a annoncé la consolidation du budget du calque à 200 millions de dollars. Donc, c'est un événement historique au Québec. Puis d'autre part, on avait choisi, ça va peut-être, je vais peut-être conclure là-dessus là, pour qu'on puisse ouvrir la discussion, mais peut-être d'autre part, je pense qu'on avait ciblé la majoration du budget du Conseil des arts et des lettres du Québec parce que c'est une institution qui permet, qui est relativement indépendante, puis qui permet de travailler justement à l'expérimentation, donc qui est moins assujetti à des orientations ou à des agendas politiques, par exemple, notamment à travers son mode de gouvernance qui est vraiment basé sur l'évaluation par les pairs, puis la réflexion par les artistes, les travailleurs culturels dans ces processus d'évaluation. Donc ça, je pense que ce serait peut-être un point important aussi. D'autre part, comment dire, il y a donc le budget a été majoré. mais tout ce qui est discussion sur les enjeux de fond a été un peu relégué au second plan, comme si comme si la majoration du budget venait mettre de côté un peu la nécessité d'avoir cette réflexion-là. Donc, c'est ça. Voilà, ça va être ça pour l'instant. Merci.
Merci, Charlotte. Yeah, we could go on because it's a beautiful story. Charlotte basically told us how they successfully created an action, what you call a triangulation, like talking to, like inviting the artist and the press and the government, and to create a conversation that produced results. Actually, it's very practical, but the results were very, although it's not a final thing, but already you targeted something very precise, like to increase the budget of the CALC, the Conseil des Arts du Québec, which is the Canada Arts Council equivalent in Quebec, to the level that makes it easier for artists. And then, but it's not over. The conversation, I mean, the fight will continue. I know there was a question also of the like in France, you know, like intermittent du spectacle, minimum income for artists. So that was also a question that was brought in. But the idea is that you can be artist and earn a living, survive from being an artist. That's the idea. But we'll make a proper translation. Thank you, Charlotte. It's already 2:06. Maybe we could take a few. Are you all ready to go a bit further, Zainub and everybody? Yeah, we can see how it goes, but let's take a couple of questions from the chat if we have any. Robert, did you open the chat to questions?
Yes, there are 5 questions currently.
Okay. And what are the questions?
Okay. The first question is from Emmeline. And it says, at the start of your lecture, so speaking to Zainub, I believe, at the start of your lecture, you emphasized that nature and culture are equally vital roots to Canadian identity, but your remarks did not return to nature. Please share your definitional thoughts on Canada's distinctive nature. Do you want me to read others, or shall we let you go with that one?
No, just one at a time.
Okay. Zainub, did you
Her
hear?
mic is off.
Maybe we could just get all the questions and then come back to it if there's only 5.
Okay. The next one was actually a question about wanting to receive the recording in French. So I think Luc already answered. Il a déjà répondu à cette question. On va faire traduire les textes. Ensuite, Marlis, okay. If culture is ever evolving and language, part of culture, is ever changing, how does one place legislation and laws to keep it the same? And then the next question actually was a comment about the youth vote in the US. And it's more of a comment than a question, I believe. I'll read it though. I read today that 43% of the youth would vote to join the US. I find this an alarming number, and it shows that we have to address the youth and engage them in alternative cultural and moral viewpoints. Otherwise, we might lose them. And then
let's bounce on this before going to other questions. We're into an election. You know, we're choosing a new leadership, and people are concerned about the level of voting by age group, and the younger age group tends to vote less than the older ones. But the future of our culture is young people. How do we make sure that the measures or the way we steer this debate around culture and sovereignty makes sense to people who are in their 20s and 30s right now? How can we convince them that it's important to preserve as you said, Zainub, the space for imagination? You know, the sovereignty is defending the space to imagine freely. How do we take them on board? Zainub, do you
Yes.
want to react to this?
Yes, yes. There's been a lot. Could you just repeat what you just said, Luke, though, what your last remark was?
I said, if our challenge, around this sovereignty and culture is to defend the space to imagine freely, to protect the space to imagine, and not to outsource our imagining to AI or to whatever, how do we make sure that we invite the people who are younger, like in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, on board along us on that question?
I think that's a really great point that you've made. And I think that just first of all, just very generally speaking, one of the things that I am really acutely aware of is that generally in the arts, we do not understand the political economy in which we exist. And my point today was about the philosophical underpinnings of what it is that we so deeply need to understand in order to make the changes that we want to, right? It's not just about the middle ground. The middle ground's corroded, right? But, the nature one is quite interesting because if we want in this country, and we could say that Indigenous people, ontologically are at the center of our conversations, they're the one with the knowledge keeping of how to live in land, right? And understand its immense geography, its forests, its rivers, its mountains, how to protect and care for it. I mean, these are the questions that I think that we haven't had enough conversations about, and also not enough intergenerational conversations about in terms of, because what we notice in an arc of 50 years of working in the sector is every 10 years the wheel is being reinvented. Why? Why is it that the same questions in different vocabularies emerge? Diversity, inclusion, equity. For example, everybody will rush out and write a memo, a communique piece, but we have been unable to provide that grounding, and I think it's partially got to do with the education system. We're constantly erased. Our work is erased. I mean, how many Canadian artists are taught, for example, at university, right? And so I think also the land has also shaped not how we live, but also how we imagine ourselves. For example, so just to yes, I didn't dwell a lot on the nature side of things, but I wanted to answer that question. So I think we could come away with what is this place of imagination that we're talking about, and what is the politics of that imagination space that prevents us actually from entering that, because we're being prevented. We're not being allowed, let's say, to imagine. But I'm sure some of the respondents would like to jump in here and say something too.
Charlotte, do you see this as a problem? The way that the younger artists that you work with, get engaged in these questions?
Oui, tout à fait. C'est sûr qu'il y a peut-être une sous-représentation là, d'autres générations, mais je trouve particulièrement intéressant la question des politiques de l'imaginaire aussi, parce que je pense que c'est à travers ça que l'art peut agir, justement, donc en proposant des langages singuliers, comme le Zainub le mentionnait aussi. Puis ce que je trouve fascinant, c'est qu'effectivement, nos structures permettent pas tant que ça une réflexion sur elles-mêmes. Tu sais, comme je disais, par exemple, pour l'instant, oui, il y a une majoration du budget, mais c'est comme si à ce moment-ci, le problème est réglé, mais la proposition du ministre demeure celle de travailler de manière sectorielle, alors que nous, on souhaite des discussions qui soient sur des enjeux transversaux, sur les questions de l'environnement, sur des questions de la précarité. Donc, en ce sens-là, c'est ça, effectivement, notre imaginaire est encadré ou construit autour de structures préexistantes qu'on doit pouvoir s'approprier autrement.
So there's an interesting lead here. Charlotte is talking about the politic of the imagination. So you said earlier that the culture cannot be contained. You know, it's this kind of, it's not an object. It's a kind of you know, it's like the air we breathe. So there's a danger in politicizing imagination. You know, like all these things that the government can do with our taxes have a limit in what they can do. But I think you're suggesting, Zainub, that we have to go beyond that. We have to imagine like something. The challenge as Canadians, like we are a collection of sovereignties, you know, the Quebec sovereignty, Alberta sovereignty, my own individual sovereignty, my family, the people I connect with. All these sovereignties have to be, maybe that's the challenge that we face in Canada. We have to create a meta sovereignty, something that respects all these sovereignties, the First Nations, you know, the land on which we live, at the same time as recognize that we're together against, you know, a very precise challenge to our freedom to imagine. So that's the situation we're in right now, and I think that's what your presentation is about. But we're not close to finding an answer.
No, and thank you for saying that. I mean, and that's exactly, you know, the problem is that we're being pitched and pitted against this idea of national culture. And that's it, you know, that's part of the problem. And I guess really, you know, I mean, I think the imagination one is really important, and we should explore that further at some point. But I think, you know, for me, this was like it really wanted to also point out that this is not a partisan issue, right? But it also takes this on it because of how national culture gets constructed all the time. And you know, I think that more conversations and more of these kinds of dialogues are needed because we need to build literacy across from all generations, across practice disciplines and engagement in of these things, because it is only through that we are going to deepen, you know, that sort of larger understanding about what is it that we're actually, why have we come together today? Is it because we've got an election next week? Yes, but that's not really it. It's much more than that. And it will go beyond that election and who wins and how much money they dedicate or don't. Because the underlying question will still be there. The underlying issues are going to still be there. So how do we all come together to take that on, I think is really crucial. And you know, thank you to the RCA really for having this platform today to allow such a conversation. I haven't seen many of these conversations actually unfold, and I think they're highly important and really necessary.
Mary Ann, how do you see this? Do you see like a light ahead of us? Is there you know, something you see like a clear road that we should choose to embark on?
I don't see a clear road. I see many roads ahead. I take hope in what I guess just from my own community and from the youth that I see who are definitely not part of that demographic who want to be part of the States. I don't know where they got those numbers from, but in terms of Indigenous youth that I know, that they have this huge an interest and a curiosity in learning not only the traditions but their languages and of applying them to their contemporary milieu, such as you know, whether it's zines or whether it's animation or VR. Like I see the how people, and it's not just Indigenous youth, other youth too as well, are grappling with these very things and being very proud of where they come from. And standing up for their difference and for their right to be themselves. So I think that, but as far as a road, it might be a bit bumpy in spots, but well, I'm sure we can find something.
Yeah. Yeah, one of our colleague, Mr. Canberra from Hamilton, who I happened to meet, Canberra. He said that he could not attend the meeting today, but he said that what we need to do as Canadians, and it goes back to Udo's point, that you found this like collection of cultural, sovereignty is interesting when you arrive from Germany, and how can you make something together with that? And he said, all we need to do is pay attention to one another, is to show interest in one another and communicate, learn the language of art, open these bridges. And it is a challenge to communicate between languages, but that's the key to everything. If we find the special recipe for communication the Canadian way, we can be as sovereign as we want, be very different, but that will be the wealth of our culture, will be the how we invented the communication means. And then we just discover one another. Our differences becomes richness. And I don't know. This would be for me the road ahead, a problem of communication and connection. Jenn, would you like to have a word on that?
Yes, thank you. I agree. I think communication is the problem at hand. It's the way, again, how do we reach one another? How do we connect with one another? How do we do that through culture? I also agree that culture, we should be careful not to politicize culture. I do think politics are part of culture, though, as well at the same time. So how do we navigate that? And when we're talking about something like the Massey report, which is sort of a federal overview, or rewriting it, which is a federal kind of overview or approach to how to deal with culture, how to engage culture from coast to coast to coast. I think, we do have to bear in mind that policies are politically defined. And that impacts us as artists, it impacts us as makers, and it impacts the platforms on which we reach each other, if not our imagination. I think our imagination hopefully is freer than that, but I think it can impact those platforms, and it does. On that note, I think that question from the beginning is, how do we keep attention? I think, Udo, you were talking about the attention economy, and how do we keep the attention, particularly of a younger generation? I think that's absolutely critical to all of this. How do we bring them into the conversation? What inspires them to share their stories? How do we engage them beyond, the digital platforms into the material world as well? Mm-hmm. So those are, all the things that are swirling around in my mind, and in terms of this particular conversation.
Udo, as a specialist of wayfinding, what path are you seeing for us? What is the signage of this new communication system?
Well, often we wayfinding designers get lost, but there is also a beauty in getting lost and wander around and discover new things that you wouldn't discover if you go the straight path. And so in my personal life, being married to an African princess, it opened up a whole new world for me. And as it was said, through touch, through slowing down and not rushing from one thing to another, you are then able to see the other and to see the beauty and the joy of being together. And culture is nature and culture and community. It all is locked together, and to slow down and to meet and to accept the other. I always said Canada for me is the land of the future because it really has these components, and sometimes it doesn't have the allure of the big media spectacles, but the real value needs to be fostered and portrayed to the young generation so that they can see it. And the government can help with programs, with grants that allows the young to have also to travel, to have different viewpoints, to study abroad, etc., etc.
Okay, we're getting close to 14:25, where we are in Montreal, Toronto, Central, Eastern Canada. Should we, Robert, should we conclude this meeting, you think, or if we should, huh? There's a lot of
behalf that I would agree with you, Luc. There's only 2 or 3 more questions, but they would be worth you knowing about. So we'll make sure that Zainub and everybody gets the question.
Okay. Can you read the questions?
You want me to read them?
Yeah.
Oh, some of them are quite long. I think what I'm suggesting is that we somehow gather them and share them.
Okay, very good. Okay, so we'll make a summary of not only the translation and summary of the conversation, but also of the questions, and we'll make a document that is the start of a new journey towards meta sovereignties in Canada. We find a special recipe to make it work. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to the RCA to host this event. And I hope to see you soon, very shortly, to move on with this wonderful topic. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup et au plaisir de vous revoir.
Bye.